than her, but he didn't want to hit her. And he didn't want the children, they had 3 minor children, he didn't want them seeing this at all. So he would usually just go outside because there would be glass breaking or things being smashed or yelling, and he knew that the neighbors might think it's him. So he would go outside so the neighbors can see what's happening. Eventually I said, look, you need professional help, and so does she, and maybe the kids do too. So I called a bunch of domestic violence shelters. I just looked around online and I called, but every place that I called said, we don't help men. We don't help male men at all. And I started becoming curious about why that was, because I learned that these were state-funded shelters. And I know that men pay at least half of the taxes that fund these shelters if they're state-funded, and I just was wondering why. So basically, there was no place to take him, and it just continued. The problem just kept going.
In the United States, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters. All of them serve female victims, and nearly all of them turn away male victims. In fact, as of 2016, there's only a single domestic violence shelter for men. My initial reaction was that there needed to be thousands more women's shelters because that many more women are being battered. But as it turns out, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination? Think of it this way. Roughly 78% of all suicides are men. If suicide prevention services only served men, wouldn't we see the gender discrimination immediately? If there are over 2,000 women's shelters that turn away men, and only 1 shelter for men, obviously the resources don't match the need.
How are you involved in the men's rights movement?
Well, from the very beginning, when I first opened the Refuge, which was in 1971, in Chiswick in London, almost as soon as I took the women in, I got a house for men.
A Voice for Men's editor-at-large, Erin Pizzey, founded the first ever women's shelter in 1971, and she is widely revered in the men's rights community.
Because you see, what I knew from the beginning, most domestic violence is consensual. Both are involved. Sometimes one's the perpetrator, the other plays the victim, then it crosses over. It's not as though it's just all men or all women. It's both, and occasionally innocent victims, very innocent.
Battered children grow up to batter, that's what I learned, whether it be a man or a woman. And I now know that if a woman comes in with a history of violence in her own childhood, the chances are she will be probably violent to her children, and she will want to live on this knife edge of crisis and danger.
I haven't been allowed to speak, that's the difficulty.
Why is that?
Because I'm completely barred from all conferences. I'm not allowed to walk up the step of my own refuge. I bought the bloody building. But no, because there's feminists, the woman who runs it is very heavily feminist. She won't have anything to do with me.
What did you say that made them hate you?
That women could be equally as violent as men. That was from the beginning.
Erin Pizzey says that 62 of the first 100 women to enter her refuge were just as violent as the men they left, and violent towards their children.
But there's levels of violence, isn't there?
I do not expect that I'm violent. Well, I'm violent.
So much.
Yeah, I'm very violent. Well, terribly, and I could quite easily hit somebody. Very, very easily. And I've had an argument.
But the feminists I've met have an entirely different take on domestic violence.
On the whole issue of domestic violence, that's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating, because that's really what it is, or dating violence. And it's not girls that are beating up on boys, it's boys that are beating up on girls, and using violence to intimidate and to control. And we have very few what's called domestic violence shelters, which are places that women can leave their home with their children and get a new start, get out of the violence. But there are not nearly enough of them. We need more funding and more resources because it is a tremendous disadvantage for women and girls.
In 2014, the CDC released a report revealing that over 5.4 million men and 4.7 million women had been victims of intimate partner physical violence within the previous 12 months. But then why does the media paint domestic violence as a women's issue?
The World Health Organization says 1 in 3 women are abused by their partner.
1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life.
And when it was addressed as a men's issue, the speaker's point was that it's a men's issue because men are the problem.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men?
Let's grant every single empirical case as being true. Yes, it is true. Let's just say, it is not true, but let's just assume that there is gender symmetry in domestic violence, that women hit men as much as men hit women. If I were to say that, I would say, and therefore we need boatloads more funding for domestic violence to develop shelters and adequate intervention, because there's this hidden epidemic of men who are being beaten up by women. Or I could say, as the men's rights movement, therefore we shouldn't have these shelters and we shouldn't fund them because the women are all lying. Well, it seems to me that if you really believe in gender symmetry, it's not that you want to, you're not questioning the number of women, you're just saying the number of men is not, you would want to join with women who are anti-violence to say, we have a real problem here. You know, it's not even a gender problem. It's a problem of women hitting men and men hitting women. We've got to get boatloads more funding. Let's work together. That seems the logical response to it. But instead they're saying it's like a zero-sum game. If we fund the women, then we're going to ignore the men. Well, we're not going to ignore the women because we all agree that the levels are as high as we say.
But it does sound like a zero-sum game when only women are receiving services in domestic violence situations. And of all the men's rights activists I've met, none of them question the number of female victims, but they are calling attention to the high number of male victims that are being dismissed. So why aren't men's rights activists and feminists working together? Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
To me, it's been fraud for all these years. Why is it we have this enormously powerful feminist movement and virtually nothing for men? Originally, it was capitalism was the big enemy in the 60s and 70s. And it was the radical feminists in America. They moved the goalposts. They said, no, it's no longer capitalism is the enemy. The enemy is patriarchy. All men. And that's how the women's movement began. And it was enormously successful. The new mood in the refuges was going to be that no men could work in refuges and can't today. They can't sit on the boards. And boys over 9 or possibly 12 can't go into refuges, or you call them shelters. Their mothers have to make other arrangements for them, which I find shocking. And it ring-fenced money. I think that particular time when the feminist movement were desperate for funding, because they'd run out of publicity, and they were desperate for funding, and they needed a just cause. And unfortunately, it fell into their laps. It's an enormous industry. I mean, violence against women, they get something like $1 billion and over a year. And an awful lot of that goes on really supposedly rehabilitating men, but essentially punishing them with something that's called the Duluth model.
Duluth Power and Control Wheel, you guys know about that? 家でか